When Brian opened his eyes, it was still dark outside. The house was still, and there was nothing in the air that could have been the cause of his awakening. Judging by his skin, the air was cool and comfortable, a typical early summer morning in the Northeast. No point in waiting, he thought. The bedside clock showed 5:11 a.m. Well, there's something to do. He threw back the blanket and stretched out his legs. The wooden floor was cool, but not unpleasant. A momentary pause, and then he stood up. The sensation of rising made him feel nostalgic. It was strange that such a thing as getting out of bed could evoke such a feeling, but it was a new day, and with it, a change in his life. Off to the bathroom. As I completed my morning ablutions, thoughts and expectations ran through my mind. What will change for me after this? And my body just moved, doing all the actions by inertia and through muscle memory. Should I get dressed? Brian decided to wear a decent shirt and pants, but nothing too flashy. It was typical of what he wore to work. Professional, but since he was often wearing a lab coat or various personal protective equipment, the suit didn't make sense. Once dressed, he went downstairs and went to the kitchen to put the kettle on. He didn't know if he had any tea. Towards 6 in the morning, he took the last of the eggs out of the refrigerator and made an omelet out of them. A lonely man's fridge was often empty, and Brian's fridge was no exception. However, he had deliberately not restocked, simply based on the uncertainty of the journey he was about to embark on. There was no point in stocking up on a bunch of food he might not need. There was so much uncertainty in all of this. But his guests weren't too generous with details. It was still another hour or so before they arrived. On the table lay a business card, black, with the name in white Gothic script on the front, Corax and Groom. He ran his finger along the edge of the card before turning it over. The lettering made his eyes ache. The back was a mirror image of the front, all white with black Gothic script. Incorrect writing. Very strange. He could have sworn it had said something different last time. But the misspelling made him chuckle. There was no contact information. There was no address or any other information about the band. Actually, the card itself was probably the least strange part of how this whole chain of events had started. Next chapter. A few months ago, at 9 o'clock on a Wednesday evening, Brian was sitting in the Yard Arm pub near the waterfront with a mug of beer in his hand. Not to say he was a regular, but the other regulars at the Yard Arm could tell the day of the week by what drink Brian was choosing. Long neck domestic beer was the sign of Wednesday. Friday, bourbon and water. Saturday, a full glass of Shiraz. For him, it was a little tokenism to dilute the monotony of heavy drinking. If he drank the same thing every night, it would be too easy to call him a drunkard. As it was, he was just eccentric. Not that he had anywhere to go or anyone to go with. No, Kristen took care of that, and took care of it very efficiently. So it was either the Yard Arm and Mitch behind the bar and whoever was there that night, or the house staring at the walls and drinking himself into oblivion. He decided that if he was going crazy, he'd rather do it in company. The bar staff was used to the pleas of lonely hearts, to their heart-wrenching stories as if they were speaking to a jury. More often than not, the storyteller was the aggrieved party and just wanted their complaints heard and validated. Sometimes it was the guilty party seeking absolution. Brian's story was unknown. He simply politely declined to talk about why he was there so often. The closest answer to a question about his past was the phrase, "If you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all." He was polite and cordial to the yard staff, and they looked at him warmly, sympathetically, but also with some sadness. He did not shy away from conversations with anyone, but he did not seek to strike up any. But in the nearly 3 years that he had been coming to the yard staff had sometimes realized from his strange look that he was ill. Nothing special in conversation or demeanor, but in the way he looked or focused his attention at certain moments. Something like a sense of longing in his gaze, from which you could tell he had once had something and then lost it. Any staff who had worked in dive bars for any length of time had seen that look, It was a man drinking himself to death because he no longer had anything to live for. The yard was quite crowded that night. Most of the tables were occupied, but there was no group, and one could have quite reasonable conversations if one had someone to talk to. Brian sat alone, sipping his fourth mug of beer. He planned to drink 2 more before walking the 3 blocks to his second-floor apartment. He looked across the bar, somewhere in the distance, at no one or nothing. "Is this seat taken?" came a dry, squeaky voice from his right. He could sense an accent in it, something vaguely European but not quite identifiable. Coming out of his reverie, he turned and found himself at chest level with a man in a black suit and overcoat. Looking up, the face towering above him was rather long and thin. The word gaunt came to mind. A pronounced Roman nose sat between high cheekbones with sunken cheeks, all above a thin, almost lipless mouth. Dark and deep-set eyes, made up almost entirely of pupils, looked down at him. Long curly hair, probably in need of a shower, spread across his high forehead, framing the man's face to his jawline. A dark cap flaunted on his head. The man stared at Brian intently, as if the answer was vital, but he was also very still. No. Help yourself." Brian suddenly needed to look away from that face, so he looked at his mid-distance focus point again and moved the bar stool slightly away from the empty chair the stranger was aiming at. The stool creaked as he moved. "Thank you kindly." Brian nodded carelessly toward the man, but never met his dark eyes again. For such a tall man, he lowered himself easily into the seat, pulling his knees up so they were just below the overhang of the bar. The posture reminded Brian of an impatient schoolboy leaning forward in his chair. The hat was removed and placed on the other side of the man. The man ordered hot tea from Mitch and pulled a small coin purse from under his dark coat. The fabric of the coat rustled quietly. Brian looked away, but found his attention fully focused on his interlocutor. With his peripheral vision, Brian saw long, bony fingers carefully remove the cup from the saucer and bring it to his mouth. A quick sip, and the cup was returned. This repeated several times until he could take no more. "Funny. Why come to a pub to have a cup of tea?" asked Brian, looking straight in front of him. "Why indeed?" Brian felt the man's lips stretch across his face. He turned his head and confirmed the smirk. The man was looking the same way Brian was looking, straight ahead of him, in the middle distance. Large teeth, yellowed and smooth as tombstones in a churchyard, framed thin, pale lips. Then the man turned to look at Brian, tilting his head slightly, and his smile grew even wider, his lips stretching across the curve of his skull. It seemed like he had too many teeth in his mouth. "I suppose it's all about the company," he continued, holding Brian's gaze and lifting his teacup to take another sip. "Maybe the conversation. If the conversation happens." Mitch approached with the renewed tea. "Thank you, sir," the man added cheerfully. He pulled a rough bronze coin with an amusing design from his wallet and swiped it across the bar. The movement was graceful and sly, like sleight of hand. The head turned to Brian again. "That interests you, A conversation?" Brian felt drawn to the man, and the dialogue began, almost reluctantly. Okay." Awkwardly. As if not knowing where to begin, he forced himself to turn in his seat toward the tall man. "I'm Brian. Brian Wally." Large, dark pores on the man's cheeks and jaw gave away his permanent 5 o'clock shadow. "Hello, Brian Wally. I'm Korax." A large, pale hand grew from the sleeve of his overcoat and reached out to shake Brian's hand. Brian's eyebrows raised slightly. "Just Korax," he said, answering the unasked question. "Is that a Dutchman?" "Not that I know of." The wide grin was slightly unsettling. "What do you do, Mr. Brian Wally?" "Please, just Brian." Korax nodded in agreement. "I'm a scientist. A microbiologist, actually." "Really? And what do you study?" "Well, it's kind of boring, but I run the operations department of a company that provides sterilization services." Korax blinked, waiting for him to continue. "We receive other companies' products, like medical and surgical supplies and the like, and then process them to make them sterile and safe for consumers. We kill all the bacteria and all the nasty stuff that lives on the products. Most people's eyes glazed over when he talked about it, but not Korax's. I find it fascinating, Brian. Consider me taking advantage of your work. Korax's eyes sparkled, and his mouth turned into a strained smile, causing Brian to take another sip of his beer. How does it work? You really want to know? It's okay for me, but a little boring. Definitely. The way Korax tilted his head made him feel like he was under a microscope. Well, we take a bulk product, packaging and all, put it in a sealed chamber and pump a very toxic gas called ethylene oxide into it. The gas seeps into the product through the packaging and kills all the microorganisms on the product. Doesn't it poison the person using it? The tall man was more interested than Brian had realized. Actually, no. Good question. He relaxed as he spoke. It was his comfort zone, and he actually enjoyed his job, even though many people found it boring. After the products are exposed, the gas is evacuated under vacuum, and then clean air is reintroduced. We repeat this procedure several times to draw out a little more gas with each cycle. Eventually, it is all removed. After a few hours, the product is completely safe to use. Gosh, that's just wonderful. You're killing so many things. He squeezed his long fingers, and his head bobbed up and down in delight. Brian smiled awkwardly, an uneasy feeling on his face. Yeah, I never thought of that. Just delightful, this ethylene oxide. The sight of the man shuddering with delight at the thought was utterly creepy, but strangely revelatory. Yeah, but like I said, it's nasty stuff. Not only does it kill everything it touches, but it's also highly explosive. Wonderful. Korax cackled, a high and reedy sound, and his dark eyes glittered. I think I like you, Brian. You've given me something to think about. Korax emptied his cup and stood up, put on his hat, and extended his long arm to Brian again. I have some business to attend to, but maybe I can talk to you again, Brian? I think I'd like to know more about you. Brian was a little taken aback at such a strange conversation, but nodded nonetheless. Despite this man's unusual appearance and odd behavior, there was something honest and attractive about him. He didn't seem malicious, he was just different. Plus, he diluted the monotony of sitting alone and slowly poisoning himself. Sure, I'm here regularly. And he smiled genuinely for the first time. Of course you're here. Korax nodded and headed for the door. He noticed that Korax had to duck his head as he walked out the door. He also noticed the other guests looking after the tall, strange man as he left. Mitch walked over and cleaned the teacup and saucer while picking up the change. He looked at the coins in his hand and did a double take, eyes wide as he did the saucer in his hand. Brian shrugged his shoulders. Mitch scurried off to the corner to look at the coins under the bright light and then scattered them in his pockets. Brian finished his beer and headed home, but he had a smirk on his face most of the time, for the first time in a long time. Next chapter. It was another 2 weeks before the strange man Korax met up with Brian again at the yard, this time on Tequila Sunrise Tuesday. The first few nights Brian returned expecting to see his strange companion. Once alone, he just drank, excessively, even by his own standards. After that weekend, Brian returned to his normal level of alcohol consumption. Brian was immersed in his own world when a voice sounded beside him. Brian? Is this seat taken? Almost a repeat of their first meeting, Brian was startled by the presence beside him before inviting the visitor to sit down. Korax lowered himself into a chair in a strange, bird-like manner, lowering his knees just below the bar. His hat was placed on the bar. Are you staying here, Mr. Korax? Brian beckoned to Mitch to bring tea. Thank you, Brian. No, I'm not stopping here. I'm passing through here on my duties. And please, if we're going to socialize, I'm just Korax. Mitch placed a cup of tea in front of him. Korax let the bag brew, then put it away. What do you do, Korax? Hmm. A pause followed. I do a lot of things, but to be honest, I'm a traveler. Here and there, here and there, here and there, he said, with a slight sing-songy tone. He sipped his tea, smiling slightly. Ah, import-export. That's what it is. Putting the cup down, he reached for his overcoat. Digging in his pocket, he pulled out a business card. Corax and Groom, in white lettering on a black card. Brian examined it. His eyes glazed over as he read the words, if that was even possible. Turning it over, he saw a white card with black letters. Moving for all. I hear there's some good money to be made on this. Brian signaled for another pour. Really? I think it's more of a calling. Those big teeth and an awkward smile. But it's not without its rewards. Who's Groom? Ah, Groom is my partner. Brian waited a bit for an explanation. Not waiting for it, he asked, and? Ah, yes, I apologize. I can be quite forgetful in conversation sometimes. Korak signaled for more tea to be poured, and a moment later pulled a coin purse from his coat. If I were the face of the organization, Groom would be the back end. He handles, shall we say, the operational aspect of the service. Mitch waited in front of Korax, while long, thin fingers pulled out two oddly sized dull silver coins and placed them on the counter. Brian didn't recognize them, but Mitch practically jumped to pick them up. Mitch stepped back again to study the coins on the other side of the bar. Korax had just brewed a tea bag. Groom traveling with you? Mitch could practically hear the thin lips pulling back in Korax's smirk. Oh yes, he's supposed to join me. The service requires the two of us. A gulp. Is he here? Yes. Korax looked at Brian spitefully. Where? He asked, looking around for someone who looked like Korax. Outside. As if that answered all questions. Why isn't he coming in? Brian turned his head, trying to see Grum outside. Well, like I said, I'm taking care of business in the service. Korax turned to Brian. His gaze became softer and more understanding. Either that, or Brian was already used to Korax's strange look and mannerisms. The groom is happy to stay out of the way of customers until he's needed, and then, well, he does what he has to do. Brian pondered this while Korax finished his tea. Standing up, Korax said, This is where we have to part ways, Brian. Oh, okay. Work? Yes, my duties are constant. Never busy and all that. Korax gestured with a raised index finger, as if reciting his business motto. Well, I wish you luck. I've enjoyed our conversation, Korax. Yes, Brian. I did too. I'll be there earlier this time, assuming I plan it right, of course. And I usually do. I hope to talk to you again in the meantime. He nodded to Mitch, who immediately stopped by to see if there was anything else he could do to help Korax. Great, Brian saluted the receding figure with his empty Collins glass. Give my regards to Mr. Groom. Korax turned around. A pause. Done, he said with a nod. That's very kind since he doesn't get to meet people as often as I do. Thank you, Brian. You're welcome. And with those words, the tall figure ducked under the doorframe and out the door, disappearing into the night. Surprisingly satisfied with the conversation and potential friend, Brian picked up the simple business card left by Korax and studied it despite his slight discomfort. Looking up, he saw Mitch placing a fresh drink in front of him. On the house, Mitch grinned. Just keep bringing your friend here. Brian wanted to ask, but decided he'd better not. Gift horses and all that. By the end of the night, Brian could barely walk and collapsed right in front of his apartment door. He woke up with a sour stomach and a sore head, but still made it to work on time. Damn tequila. Next chapter. It was a week before Korax showed up at the yard and took a seat next to Brian after being invited in. How you doing, Korax? Mitch brought a teacup with a small teapot for brewing, which separately held loose tea leaves and boiling water. Was this a highlight? A unique set of services for infrequent customers? Brian looked at Mitch, puzzled as to where the new level of service had come from. Mitch was only paying attention to the long, lean figure of his companion. The bartender's gaze followed a hand reaching into his coat pocket, into his wallet. This time, a dull, oddly shaped coin lay on the counter, tarnished, golden in places, which Mitch took immediately, thanking him as he left. Pretty busy, but I happened to be in the neighborhood, and my colleague Grum reminded me that he sends his regards, so here I am. Please thank him for me. A nod and a smirk indicated that he would. It would be my pleasure. Listen, you seem to be here quite often. Is that right? Brian nodded. Is there any reason for that? Shouldn't a man like you be with family? Brian froze under his intense gaze for a moment, contemplating whether to discuss the subject. In all the years he had come to the yard, he had never discussed why he was here, why he was slowly drinking himself to death, or why he would never be with a woman again. But there was a uniqueness to Korax in that thought. This was a man who was completely outside of Brian's world. If he revealed his story, Korax wouldn't be able to repeat it to anyone else. Brian's embarrassment and shame would not be shared with his coworkers or anyone else. The very nature of the story was a burden. Carrying something so poisonous to him without being able to get rid of it was torture in itself. Thinking this over, he decided to tell his interlocutor something he hadn't talked about with anyone in years. No family, no wife. He took a sip, preparing himself for the unpleasant task ahead. At least there's no wife now. It's a short story. Korax tilted his head and leaned forward with genuine interest. I have time to spare, and it seems you have a story to tell. Please continue. I will be a patient listener. Next chapter. I met Kristen at work about 20 years ago. I lived on the other side of the country and was a staff microbiologist at another sterilization company where I did lab work and provided customers with test results. During a performance review, the operations manager promoted me from lab to shift supervisor. This meant an increase in pay and more responsibility. I gladly accepted. Things were going well at the plant and our business was expanding, so one of my first jobs was to work with my boss, the plant manager, to expand production. I was single, and although I dated occasionally, I was very career-focused, so serious relationships just didn't exist for me. The first project I got involved in was that the company needed to add new sterilization chambers and hire additional staff to handle the workload. The sterilization process itself is very dangerous because ethylene oxide gas is highly toxic and explosive, so building a new facility was a nightmare of permits, bureaucracy, and safety inspections. But over time, with a lot of effort, we built the facility and hired new staff. One of the new employees was a young engineer named Kristen Urshaki. She was of average height, with fine facial features and a slender, athletic build. Nothing too big or small, everything in its place. I found her very attractive without being a model. She was hired to work directly on the floor, overseeing a process that basically involved moving a client's product into the chambers, running a specific sterilization recipe for that client, monitoring the cycle, purging the product of gas, and retrieving the product for shipment to the client. To be a woman on any engineering team is to draw attention to yourself. STEM fields are male-dominated, and women, while not rare as hen's teeth, were a fairly rare commodity. In addition to being attractive, she was a solid engineer. She had spent 3 years in industrial processes before joining us, so she already had the confidence and general industry intelligence that many graduates lacked. This meant she wasn't easily intimidated by men taking poses. She could tell them where to stick them. I liked that about her. She wasn't my direct report, but she was in my budget line, so I watched her without interfering with her career. But sometimes I couldn't resist watching. After about 3 months on the job, she found herself on the floor watching the flushing procedure. In the flushing process, residual gas is removed from the chamber by pumping out the gas, and then the chamber is filled with air or an inert gas such as nitrogen. This happens several times, with each subsequent flushing reducing the amount of poison inside. Of course, the exhaust gas must be vented to the atmosphere. To avoid killing all the neighbors, which would be bad for business, we heat the exhaust gas before it goes out, using a system called an oxidizer. Simply put, next to the exhaust pipe, the gas is passed through a weak flame, causing traces of explosive gas in the exhaust to be safely converted into non-toxic gases, such as carbon dioxide, which we can safely release into the atmosphere. Normally, this is safe because the gas concentration was below the explosive level. But on this day, something went wrong. The night shift replaced sensors in one of the chambers and signed off on the authorization to return the equipment to service. Kristen and another engineer were on the floor checking the unit with product inside to make sure it was working properly. The replaced sensor had a faulty ground wire that shorted out after the qualification run. Long story short, Kristen and her companion had a much higher concentration of gas in the chamber than they thought, and if they did a flush, it would send it into the oxidizer. They were at ground zero next to a bomb that could destroy half the facility. If the explosion had spread to the ethylene oxide stockpile, the entire building and most of the neighborhood could have disappeared with it. In the aftermath, we discover that Kristen's engineer, Ken Foley, who was supposed to be mentoring her, was flirting with her while they did their work. The idiotic part is that both were wearing chemical-resistant coveralls with protective masks and respirators. The ward doesn't allow street clothes, so it's like flirting with someone in full body armor. Nothing to see. What's the point? Save it for office hours. But it was enough to distract both of them, and they missed the malfunctioning sensor going off. Ken's unprofessionalism could have led to a major industrial accident. As luck would have it, I found myself in the control room, which is a shielded cubicle overlooking the camera area. In the CR, the data stream is much more detailed than what the engineers on the floor see, since we have information on all the cameras, not just the one Kristen and Ken were operating. I picked up a tripped sensor in their chamber, and just as Ken went to start the first flush, I hit the shutdown button and locked out the system before the gas could escape. I gasped, being the only one who realized at that moment how close we all were to actual death and destruction. It was all I could do not to wet myself on the spot. Ken entered the key into the loop again, but was locked out. He tried again, but this time the system was locked out as well. As calmly as possible, I got on speakerphone to the control room and told the two of them to leave the floor and go up to the CR for a meeting. As soon as they undressed and met me, I led them both into the conference room and repeated the events, with my hands shaking the entire time. They immediately realized how close they were to blowing up half the plant and committing suicide. I had already experienced a moment of panic in CR, and the adrenaline had finally left me. I watched in real time as Ken and Kristen experienced a moment that could have ended in ignominious death because Ken couldn't keep it in his pants. As soon as they caught their breath, Ken started apologizing to both Kristen and me. He understood. He was a good engineer and realized that the slightest misstep at the wrong time on this job could be the last one of his life. I gave them both a day off to think about it, as I didn't want two overstressed people making new mistakes. But at the same time, I knew that both would learn a lesson and become better engineers. It was an expensive lesson that I didn't want to repeat, and I didn't think of it again until almost 6 months later. The annual Christmas party was held at a local hotel and was a large enough event to mark the end of an eventful year. The company rented rooms for a few of us so we wouldn't have to drive home. After the party, a few people from my group went into town and visited a few bars and pubs, because why not? At one point, Kristen cornered me with shot glasses and started thanking me for saving her life. I really hadn't thought about it. I honestly told her I wasn't happy about what had happened, but pointed out that both she and Ken had become very reliable team members, and I expect them to do well in the future. One try led to several, and soon she and I were chatting at a separate table away from coworkers. I questioned her about Ken, asking if he was successfully chasing her. She grinned and said he was charming, but she wasn't dating coworkers. 2 hours later, we were on the bed in our hotel room. Except that wasn't the end of it. On the first Friday of the new year, I opened the door at 9 p.m. and found Kristen there. She smelled like alcohol, but she wasn't drunk. I was more than surprised at her bold act of showing up at my door uninvited. She smirked as she entered my apartment and told me that she knew I was married to my job, so she could find me at home. While this was true, I also reminded her that this could be considered a date and that I would hate for her to backtrack. She stepped close to me and ran her index finger across my sternum. I really enjoyed our Christmas party and was hoping to relive some very fond memories, she whispered. By March, we had begun an irregular FWB relationship, and although we maintained a purely platonic relationship in the office, about twice a month I made regular deposits into Kristen's bank. We kept it a secret, and as far as I knew, the office knew nothing about us. She never said if she was sleeping with anyone else, and I never asked. I made the decision to trust her based on the professionalism she displayed at work. It ended up being a mistake that doomed us. After 9 months, Ken left the company, and Kristen was promoted to fill the vacated senior engineer position. Kristen was right in that I was heavily invested in the company, and there was nothing serious for me except once or twice a month, as the company was always taking up time I could have spent on relationships. Nevertheless, I was getting more and more used to her visits, her bottomless throat, and her athletic approach to emptying my balls. Repeatedly. As usual, she took the initiative and said she wanted to break her vow and start dating me, exclusively and publicly. I coordinated this with the company's HR department, and she was removed from my authority. This was challenging for us because I had all the engineering managers under my direct reporting line, so there was a lot of opportunity for her to move around within the company. Shortly after this decision and the removal of restrictions from our relationship, she inspired me to take serious action. Privately, she rang all my bells. She fueled my romantic passion for her. We went on trips. I bought her gifts. She didn't need anything. Professionally, Kristen agreed to move into marketing and sales, which was a new field for her, and she left my influence. However, she had a good mentor who gradually brought her up to speed and used her intelligence, experience, and good looks to win over clients. She was a real triple threat, and she really enjoyed it. She grew from a supporting role to being dragged to clients for lunch, dinner, and several trade shows. Each time she came back to me voraciously and had fun with me. Nearly 18 months after that accident, I put a big sparkler on her finger and she agreed to marry me. For the first few years, marital bliss was just that. I ran the company through its first expansion and then its second. Profits grew steadily, and I received what I thought was fair recognition for my efforts in the form of stock and bonuses. Kristen's career took off as well, and soon she was being invited to work for large companies. We discussed this, and I gave her the freedom to choose her career path. She decided to leave and join a multinational conglomerate. There were so many late nights and long weekends when we hardly saw each other, like ships passing in the night. But it was worth it when we connected. We didn't have kids yet, but she just passed 30 and was talking about getting some return on investment, so she quit the pill. 2 years later, Alexa showed up. Taking on a nanny, Kristen went back to work after her vacation and continued her climb. I adored my baby girl. I spent every night with her in my arms. We were both making good money and had acquired some of the trappings of that wealth: a luxurious house in the suburbs, nice cars, and anything else Chris needed or wanted. I continued to spoil her, giving her anything she wanted. After 7 years together, Kristen brought me to the ballroom of a luxury hotel where her company was having a Christmas party. Everything was top-notch. After about 10 minutes, I heard a familiar voice. "Hi, Brian. Funny to meet you here." I turned around, and standing in front of me was Ken in a dark suit that hugged his athletic physique. It was indeed a surprise. I turned to Kristen, but she was already reaching out to hug him. Once that was done, he reached out to me, squeezing my hand tightly. "This is a surprise," I voiced my thoughts out loud. "Do you work here?" "Yes," he pointed out. I turned to Kristen again, her graceful facial features giving nothing away. I joined at the beginning of the year. I'm heading up one of the engineering groups, doing research on oxidizers. Oh, that's wonderful. Kristen didn't tell me you were here. Well, we don't work together, and she's not in engineering anymore. So I've heard, he grinned. Still a sly bastard, I thought. Chris gave me an oops. Smile, but didn't say anything else on the subject. Let's get something to drink, Ken said, directing us toward the bar. My antennae were on high. I played the role of dutiful spouse while so many coworkers, enough for a small phone book, came to Chris's house to congratulate her on her latest campaign. I had met many of them at past parties, but Chris's recent successes had made her more prominent in the company, and this was clearly her night to shine. I took it calmly, after all. The hours away from home had paid off, and she was ready for a real takeoff. Ken appeared and disappeared from the groups around us, occasionally dropping in on me to have a word or two. Apparently, he had worked for several chemical companies in the area before joining this company. He was trying to get information out of me about how we were using oxidizers in the various new designs we were working on. I wasn't about to fill him in on the details of some of the designs we were working on. We sat down at the table for dinner, and Chris was really on her own. Not only was she the center of attention at our table, but several people came up to her to say hello and try to strike up a conversation with her. She told me she was a little surprised at all the attention. I assured her that I was proud of her. After dinner, there was a sprinkling of calls for Chris to give her time, both on the dance floor and while discussing new projects. Several times she pulled away from me, throwing me looks like, "I'm sorry, what can I do?" But I just waved and let her go. Ken continued to flutter around, taking various women to the dance floor where he moved confidently. Chris would come back and pull away again, sighing. At one point, she insisted on being left for a few minutes with her husband. The petitioner pulled away, apologizing. "I'm sorry, honey," she said, overlapping the noise of the orchestra. "I really wasn't expecting this, but at the same time I'm pleased to be recognized." "Don't worry, sweetheart. Alexa and I are proud of you." She smelled of alcohol and sweat. "I'll do it with you upstairs later," she grinned. She quickly pulled away and I headed towards the bar with a sigh. I was done drinking, as I didn't want to lose control of myself, and I wanted to be able to perform. I was 10 years older than Chris, so if I wanted to keep up with her Olympic desire, I needed to plan ahead. I lost sight of her for about 20 minutes, but found myself involved in a conversation with a microbiology department head I knew from several professional organizations. He and I chatted in a more social setting, as we were both of the opinion that store talk was best left for business hours. We were making plans to meet for a drink when Chris slipped in beside me, a little out of breath. "There you are," she said, hugging me from behind. "I'm tired of all this shit. Don't you want to make baby number 2 upstairs?" "Looks like our reunion will have to wait," my coworker said. Laughing, I wished my coworker a Merry Christmas and made plans to reunite in the new year. In the elevator ride up to our room, Chris was all over me. I could smell cigarette smoke and something else underneath besides booze and sweat. I put it off for later. But true to her word, Chris didn't let me rest until I had emptied my balls into her dripping saliva 3 times and leisurely drank a 4th before breakfast. Chris was very convincing. She announced in February that she was expecting a baby, and in early September, our son Henley was born. It was Chris's show again at this party. Not as brazen as last year, but this year Chris seems to have bought into her own press clippings. Last year's demure Chris was replaced by an overbearing and arrogant version, looking every bit like the grade A bitch she was dressed as. Several times she left me to myself for 10 minutes or more while she met with important people. Worse was when she blatantly ignored me when I was around her. Ken showed up at this year's party and seemed to be getting much closer to Chris. Something was definitely not right. The dinner was a mess. More and more important people walked by, and Chris hardly talked to me or ate any of her food. During the dancing, I got the one and only pity dance, while she was out on the parquet with Ken most of the time. I couldn't even cut in as they'd move aside when they saw me. That shit was too much. I left the bitch there and went home. There I looked in on each of my sleeping children. I loved them very much, and no matter what happened that night, I loved Chris for bringing them into this world with me. I needed to keep that in mind as I reflected on her behavior during the night's activities. I was home for about an hour before she noticed my absence, but then the calls and texts started, including one from Ken. I deleted them all and turned my phone off. Close to 2 in the morning, Chris burst through the door, screaming from the foyer about what an asshole her husband was. She quieted down, but soon was practically yelling at me again for leaving her. She looked like a sloppy drunk. If she felt that bad, I knew she was about to pass out. I dragged her to the breakfast room, which was as far away from the children's rooms as possible, so her screams wouldn't wake them up. She mocked me, talking about my manhood, how weak I was, and how this relationship had always been on her mind. I listened as she talked about what she was doing for me, and how she already had a line of men lined up wanting to be with her tonight. I was there. I could see it. I kept my mouth shut on purpose, knowing she'd get tired of drinking and it would all be over soon and I'd carry her to bed. But then she started talking about Ken and how wonderful he was, how good he was to her, and how things could have been different if she had chosen him over me almost 10 years ago. It hurt, and there was something about it that always bothered me. I knew she was ranting. I knew she was drunk and trying to hurt me, but there was always something about Ken that kept me going. Mentally, I was also waiting for her to start belittling me for my performance in bed. But surprisingly, that didn't happen. As was her habit, she quickly ran out of breath. Using up the last of her strength to scream, she soon slumped to the floor. I picked her up in my arms and carried her upstairs. She reeked of alcohol, sweat, and men's cologne, no doubt from her dancing. I took off her shoes and put her on the bed. I didn't undress her. That would take effort, and frankly, I was tired, and the bitch didn't deserve that kind of effort. Let her ruin her dress by sleeping in it. Hopefully, she'd also throw up on it for extra convincing. I went to sleep in the guest room. I woke up with an excruciating morning country pain. It felt weird sleeping in a different bed. "Oh, you're awake," Chris whispered. "The kids left with the babysitter, so I brought you breakfast in bed." She apologized over a simple breakfast, saying that the job took too long, that she was getting all this recognition and praise, and after a while, it was hard not to buy into it. It's a job, and you have to pay a certain amount of money for it, and you have to pay networking fees, and how she hated that part of the job. She knew how to work, and was happy just doing it. If she could avoid extraneous noise, she would happily lock her office door and not come out of there until she got home at the end of the day. "You came home last night and you smelled like cologne," I remarked, keeping my eyes on her to follow her reaction. "I'm surprised I didn't smell like a dozen different kinds. You saw me on the dance floor. I wasn't dancing. I was an accessory to a higher power, and that was one of the fees I had to pay. I told you I hated it." "Then quit," reasoned I. "We don't need the money, and you can always use your skills elsewhere. You're not the only one who gets hurt by this, you know." "I'm sorry it's come to this, but I'm almost at the point where it's over, where I can be free of it, and yes, probably go my own way." Her face was still as beautiful as I knew it to be, and her eyes looked up at me as she asked me to bear with her a little longer. That was enough for me. "And Ken? I have a really bad feeling about this." A little irritated. "Let me deal with him. Please." We didn't raise our voices in anger, and for the moment we had come to an agreement satisfactory enough for both of us that we could be a happy family again. But really, that was the beginning of the end. In the new year, Chris began to drift away from us, spending more and more time at the office. At least twice a week she would come in after 9 p.m., looking tired and exhausted. She would eat a few spoonfuls of food and go to bed. With me, she was tolerant, but not as loving a spouse as I expected. I spent more time with the kids to compensate and gave her small gifts, like flowers to the office or a Saturday spa day where she could relax. Maybe twice a week we managed to socialize in bed. But even there, she didn't seem to show herself. It was all foreplay until I came home one night in June. It wasn't that easy that night because I got home a little late, around 7 p.m., and Chris was already home. I arrived to catch the babysitter putting the kids to bed and Chris dressing. She looked stunning. Light makeup, hair done, manicure, stiletto shoes. Am I forgetting something? I asked. She shook her head. No. What's the occasion? I'm going for a walk, she said, as if that answered all questions. Obviously it didn't, but before I could discuss it further, the doorbell rang. She looked at the watch I had bought her for our 5th anniversary. She nodded, saying, Can you take it? It's for you. I looked at her puzzled. The second bell rang and I moved toward the door. It was opened by a middle-aged man in a slightly worn suit. Brian Wally? Yes? You've been served, he said. Excuse me. Handing me a manila envelope, he turned on his heel and walked away. What the hell? I picked my jaw up and walked back into the house. Pulling out the papers, I realized Chris was divorcing me. I'm going to be very fair, Bri. We can divide the property and you get to keep. What the hell is this, Chris? I interrupted. Some kind of sick joke? She pulled on her shoes, emphasizing her muscular legs. Her face softened and she looked sad, but not upset. Not like her heart had been ripped out of her. Not like her world was crumbling around her. It was all on my conscience. This was my night. How to realize that the life you knew was a lie. I'm sorry, Brian. She clenched her hands into fists, but that was just the limit of what she was feeling. I'm really sorry, but we've had our way, and this is what's best for everyone. How? How is it best for me? How am I supposed to accept this? I was on the verge of hysterics. Tears were flowing freely, and my heart was pounding in my chest. My thoughts were so scattered that I could barely form a coherent sentence. My wife, my love, was gone. While I was panicking, the doorbell rang again. Chris motioned for him, and I tried in vain to wipe the tears from my face, but there were more and more of them. And the snot coming out of my nose made me feel like a preschooler. From the foyer came the soft voices of a man and Chris. I turned around. Sure enough. Ken was in one of his custom-made suits, kissing my wife on the cheek. I'm sorry, Brian, he said. It's just the way it is. Again, as if that explained everything. Closing the door, Chris took his hand and led him inside. Get him out of my house! I hissed, turning up the volume until I was screaming the last word. No, Brian, I want him here. They looked at each other and then at me. Look, Brian, you didn't do anything. It's just... For how long? Sobbed I. Chris looked a little nervous. Always. What? My brain wasn't working fast enough to grasp the enormity of what I'd been told. Better just rip the blindfold off, honey, Ken said, stroking her shoulder and guiding her over to the couch where they both sat down. I was ready to snap his goddamn arm off. Brian, this isn't going to be easy or pleasant for you, but please sit down, Chris said softly, in a tone that I would have once taken as loving. I scooted over. I always did that when I was nervous. No, I'll stand. Speak up and let's get this over with. Again, I'm sorry about this, but I need to deal with this. Brian, today is the 10th anniversary of you saving Ken and me from the explosion at the plant. None of us can thank you enough for what you did. But that day after the meeting, you sent us home. We left work, but because of the adrenaline rush and the feeling of near death, we went home together. I was so happy to be alive. We were both happy. I went home that day, tried to forget about it, and went back to work the next day. Both Ken and I felt something that day, but I figured it was just that, a one-time thing. I avoided it for a few days, but he convinced me to try it again, but without the adrenaline and everything that comes with it. This time it was even better. We sat there after that second time, both happy but at the same time sad at having come so close to losing everything. We knew we owed it to you. So we came up with a plan. I would sleep with you to repay you for saving us. We knew you liked me from all the looks you threw at me in the office. But we didn't tell you why, but that first night I let it slip. We both knew this was going to be a long-term project to pay you back, and we both plunged headfirst into it, with that silly enthusiasm of youth and the realization that we were smarter than everyone else. The more we were together, the more we realized how much we owed you, so we settled on a number. 10 years, I said, looking at the two monsters disguised as humans on my couch. They both nodded. Ken stroked her shoulder, reassuring her. I would give you 10 years of love and affection in payment for the debt we owe you. And now we have finalized our bargain and ask you to respect our desire to move on with our lives, for the good of all. Respect? Respect? Growled I. What the hell do you know about respect? I respect the shit I took this morning more than I respect the two of you right now. Chris, come on. There has to be something? Don't you feel anything for me? Ken's hand removed from her shoulders and she straightened up. Don't be silly, Brian, she sighed. She looked at Ken and he nodded. This was all planned. Brian, She paused. We both owe you so much, and I've always had a genuine love and respect for the way you saved and provided for me. But every day for the past 10 years, I have belonged to Ken. Brian, Ken continued, grinning, we're both immensely grateful to you, but there's no point in continuing to lie. You're young enough to find someone else and start over. Alexa and Henley should be with their father. God damn it. It felt like a physical blow. I faltered, muttering, leaning on the chair for balance. I ran DNA on both of them, and they're both Ken's. Chris and I gave you a little extra to compensate for raising my kids, but it's time for me to take responsibility for my fertility. We want more, and we won't wait. I was gone. Mentally, I was out. A decade of betrayal. The shattering of my hopes for happiness and family. The deception on their part. The way the evening had been planned and executed in cold blood. It was devastating. It guaranteed that I wouldn't fight to reconcile and let them make a quick and clean exit while I cleaned up the mess in my life. Physically, I needed to leave before I did something irreversible. Walking up the stairs and into the bedroom, I put my life in my suitcases. As I heard the front door close, I realized I had a little time. I checked again what I needed and realized I had been on the move since I was told. I took a breath and sat down on the bed. Our bed, which I assume was never mine. I thought for a minute and realized that I needed to take steps to put all of this behind me as soon as possible. I called the plant manager, my attorney, and my brother, letting them know what had happened. I pulled myself together as best as I could. I had been played, and I was way behind. I got a commitment for a divorce petition, a job transfer to the other side of the country, and a person to interfere in family matters until I was healed. I packed up my car, left my wedding ring on the kitchen table, and went upstairs one last time. I spent 10 minutes looking down at each child I considered my own and my legacy. It didn't matter whose genetics they were made of, they were a part of me and I would always love them. Next chapter. And that's where I got here from, he said. He raised his glass as a sign that despite the physical move, the mental side of the incident still haunted Brian. Korax remained virtually motionless throughout the story. At the end, he remained motionless and then blinked. Coming back to reality, Korax straightened up. Brian, I rarely lose my breath, but the story you told me is really beyond what I usually encounter in dealing with people. He sipped his tea and took a sip, ignoring the fact that it had managed to get cold during Brian's story. And afterward? He asked, afraid to push Brian too hard. Not so much. I pieced together some moments that didn't make sense at the time. Chris and Ken entertained at least twice a week throughout their marriage. He even had a private room in the hotel where we played the wedding. After the Christmas party, she quit her job and moved to a new company, so I couldn't bring any foreclosure action against her company. Of course, she never told me about it. Since then, I haven't spoken to or heard from the kids in almost 10 years. And I'm not sure I want to now. Alexa will barely remember me, and Henley won't even remember me at all. It's best to leave those lies alone, he said quietly. I don't trust women in any personal relationships. I've been alone since that night, and I have no desire to be with a woman again, intimate or not. I guess I don't trust myself, you know. Brian felt strange. Yes, this story was horrible. It had been perpetrated by two evil men who lacked humanity, no matter what reasons they gave for their horrible behavior. But enough time had passed, and he had relived it so many times in his head, alone. To express it all to Korax, who was as neutral and unattached a listener as possible, was, in a word, liberating. The strange feeling Brian was experiencing was freedom. Well, Brian, I am touched by your story. My time is limited tonight, but I hope to return soon. But before I go, I must ask a few questions. I hope they will be brief and not cause you too much excitement at this difficult time. No, that's fine. Talking to you has been very therapeutic. I've never told this story to anyone except my brother and my lawyer. I appreciate you letting me talk it out. You're a good listener and a good friend. Korax looked at Brian. Korax tilted his head and smiled relaxedly, hiding his yellow teeth. I like that, Brian. Thank you. Brian, don't you want to see the kids again? Talk to them? If you could? Brian wasn't prepared for such a question. He paused for a moment. No. No. I don't think so. I think whatever awaits them in life is beyond me right now, except that they were innocent in this, and I hope they weren't touched by their horrible parents. I still love them and hope for the best. I understand, the tall man said. In light of events, that is a very commendable sentiment. Korax got ready to leave, and Brian wished him a safe journey and asked about Groom. The tall man turned and addressed Brian in a strange manner with his head tilted. Yes, Groom sends his regards and thanks for your concern. Would you like to meet again sometime? I have a proposition for you. Brian nodded. Sure. I'll contact you shortly with a time and place. Korax nodded and left the yard, ducking as he crossed the threshold. Next chapter. The following Friday, Brian's cell phone rang, the number untraceable. Hello? Hi, Brian. This is Korax. Groom and I are in town and we're wondering if we could meet you tonight. The thought of never giving Korax his phone number was slightly disturbing. Brian had nothing but the yard on his schedule, so he agreed and planned an early dinner. At 8 p.m. in the park, located 3 blocks from the yard and near the waterfront, Brian sat on a bench in one of the most secluded corners of the park. The streetlights overhead illuminated the scene, and Korax in his coat seemed made of shadow and darkness. Beside him in the grass lay a medium-sized dog of indistinguishable breed. It was shaggy and ungroomed, its coat mottled with shades of tan, white, and gray. Both Korax and the dog watched Brian walk toward them, but neither made a move until Brian approached. Remembering Korax's habit, Brian repeated, "May I join you?" The tall man smiled understandingly and gestured for him to sit on the bench next to him. From his coat pocket, Brian pulled out a silver vacuum thermos. He held it out to the tall man, who accepted it with a raised eyebrow reaching almost to his hairline. Hello, Korax. I brought you some tea since we're not at the yard arm. I was worried I didn't have a second cup for Groom, but he's not joining us, is he? Oh, Groom's here, he said, gesturing to the dog. There's nothing wrong with tea. He's not an amateur. Brian sighed. He knew now that Korax was a psycho. It had always been obvious. The out-of-style clothes, the odd mannerisms, the sloppy and formal speech. Well, it's a nice evening and Korax isn't violent, so he relented and sat down. Brian, in my role, I've seen the best and worst sides of humanity, and indeed everything in the world. I don't see enough goodness. Such is the nature of the role, and such is the burden that comes with it. I accept it gladly. But you have shown me kindness in your friendship, in your manner of speaking to someone like me when most other people would have simply shied away, and compassion for those you've never even met. such as Groom. Groom rose from the ground and sat up in a sitting posture, panting slightly but looking at me. No, you had little reason to be kind and merciful, but you were nonetheless. And for that, I was allowed to do you one favor. A chance, so to speak. It came at a high price, but I think few people I've met would have deserved the opportunity more than you. Korax opened the thermos and poured some tea into a cup with a lid. In the light of the sodium lamp, the tea steamed. He saluted Brian with the cup before taking a sip. Brian felt uncomfortable. Korax was nuts, that much was self-evident. But as he spoke, his voice grew deeper. No, that wasn't the right word. There was more presence in his voice, as if he was speaking from a chest of an entirely different size or shape. At the same time, there was a confidence in it, as if a sweet warmth surrounded him, amber and peaceful, as Korax spoke. The groom wagged his tail, but otherwise remained motionless. If you'll forgive me, I'm getting a little pompous here, but I think I have some explaining to do. You're not alone, Brian, and I mean that in a very cosmic sense. This universe and everything in it is one of countless, countless existences. Each one is a little jewel, self-sufficient and whole. They themselves are contained within a larger space. Brian wasn't too pleased. If Korax was going to spout some crazy nonsense about time and space, he was already regretting having decided to come. Groom stood up and walked over to Brian, sitting down across from him. Looking at the dog, Brian gasped when Groom spoke. Hello, Brian Wally. We have not been formally introduced to each other, but I am Groom. I thank you for the good wishes you conveyed through Korax. The concepts Korax is talking to you about are very important, but you may need some support to understand some of them. The entire conversation was going on in Brian's head. All of Groom's thoughts and ideas appeared in Brian's head at once, as if Groom and he were already talking, and the dialogue was a memory and not spoken aloud. It was just there, in his head. Groom was not a talking dog. Talking dogs don't exist. Groom was something much scarier. Before Brian could get a word out, something big and black flew out of Groom's mouth, followed by another and another and another, until what looked like a dozen spikes stretched Groom's upper jaw so that it was pointing skyward, completely separated from his lower jaw. Groom's canine head crawled back, the spikes slowly diverging from the center. It continued like this until the dogskin reached the obstacle. There was a small pop, and the leather and fur crawled back, exposing the knuckles in one of the spikes. More knuckles appeared in the other spikes. The exposed knuckle spikes bent down and rested on the ground. They were articulated legs. Now that Groom could keep his balance, his dogskin shed much more easily, revealing something Brian was not meant to see. Groom had come into this dimension from somewhere where things like him made sense, and he entered this world through a dog's body. Brian's pulse pulsed in his arteries, and he wondered if Korax's madness had been passed on to him. If this was what Korax had seen, it was no wonder the guy had lost his mind. Coco Korax? He looked over to the bench and saw the man sipping his tea, watching the horrifying sight before him. Showing off. Now you see why I don't often take him out in public, was all Korax said. Brian was terrified to look at Groom's ghastly form, but at the same time, it was impossible to disobey the compulsion. Less than a yard away from Brian stood the nightmare of nightmares. Grum was black, about 10 feet tall and nearly 30 feet long, completely covered in a shiny black carapace. It was close to a praying mantis and a spider in its combination of body parts. But there were too many legs and eyes. A thorax with neck and head was topped by vibrating antennae sticking out from the top of its head. A cruel beak peered out of its mouth, from which yellowish saliva dripped beneath the enormous mass. But the more Brian looked, the less he saw. None of it made sense. Brian couldn't pick up any human features, except that some of the short legs ended in three-toed arms, bending and unbending in a complex rhythm. This only made the situation even more confusing. Panicked and speechless, Brian looked at Korax again, trying to keep on the other side of the madness. Brian Wally, I'm only showing you this to make you realize how little you understand about the things around you. You're in no danger, and you're in no danger, Grum said. All in his head again, all at once. The same Graham who was a dog again. Gone was the intense insect-like hallucination that had nearly caused Brian to empty his bladder. Groom walked over to Korax and returned to a sitting position. It's like I said, Brian. To call this reality a multiverse is doing it a disservice. There are actually a lot of realities. But the thing is, Groom and I would like to help you. We are limited in what we can do, and there is a small window in which we can make adjustments. Every self-contained reality has a beginning and an end. They are separated by what you might consider time. There is a direction in which things move, cause begets effect, and so on. However, time itself introduces disruptions to this flow. There is no fate or master plan. Each universe evolves uniquely according to the events that occur, and time is the regulator of those events. Each of these regulated possibilities gives rise to a new set of possibilities, which in turn give rise to their own set of possibilities. And so on. Brian could understand this. He loved popular science books on astronomy, the universe, and cosmology. Korax described the many worlds theory of the universe, but did so with the assurance that it was all real. Since Brian sat on that bench, it was probably the least crazy thing he'd seen or heard. Right now, new universes are being born out of this universe. All it takes is a single atomic particle that moves left instead of right after a collision to spawn a new element of the collective. All possibilities are real, all are being explored. All are connected, like parents or children in a real and tangible cluster of time and energy, like a collective. Groom and I have our own role in this. My role in this is unique to those members of the collective who had the conditions for life to emerge. Life, especially life capable of realizing its condition, is relatively rare, and it occurs because of a unique energy. A soul? Nothing that complicated, I'm afraid. There is no heaven, and you won't live forever. But you already know that. It's energy, but energy with a trace going to higher dimensions beyond your part of the collective. My role in this is to escort your energies out of the cage you are in. You would say, cross over. Groom guides that energy through the networks connecting the various universes within the collective to its destination. And to where? Not here, Korax grinned. Your death? Like death with a capital letter? No, not at all. Korax paused, hesitating. Do you remember your mythology? Brian nodded. A good analogy would be the Greeks' idea of Charon, the ferryman who escorted the dead to Hades. He wasn't death, but he was part of the experience. I will be Charon, and Groom will be the boat that takes you from this part of the collective to the area that requires your energies. We are different aspects of the collective psychopomp. Holy shit. This is unreal. Brian began to hyperventilate, grabbing the bench. Easy, easy, Brian. Korax patted him on the back encouragingly. Part of the reason we're telling you this is because we believe you can realize the magnitude of what we're telling you. The other part is that time is fixed here. What has passed in this space cannot be changed. However, from the perspective of this universe, all other possible parts of the collective are, shall we say, adjustable? Brian was beginning to understand. And that would overwrite all possible and subsequent spawns of this event, except the origin. Korax's anxious smirk reflected on Brian's smirk. It seemed logical to Brian. It completely ruled out the grandfather paradox in this universe. And the price? Your energy so that I can transport you across the membrane, and Groom can step out of this collective reality and seed your particular event in the web. There's always a price to pay. Brian nodded. That was fair enough. How do you do it? Korax reached into his pocket and pulled out an old early-generation cell phone, about the size of a paperback book and with a rigid antenna. When? When would you like it? Next chapter. Brian had finished his scrambled eggs and was about to leave when suddenly there was a knock on his apartment door. Looking at his watch, he realized it was 7 in the morning. The staff was working on time. He went to the door and let in a tall man in black clothes and his shaggy dog. He greeted them warmly. Tea for Korax and some eggs for Groom. You ready, Brian? The two voices harmonized in his head, making bittersweet music. For a moment, Brian saw a large but friendly raven in front of him. Brushing away the tears, Brian nodded. Is it going to hurt? Much less than it already hurt you, the voices said. Brian tensed. Please have a seat. Brian led them both into the living room and motioned for them to sit on the couch. Taking a deep breath, he looked at the two people dressed as monsters sitting on the couch. All right, I'm ready. Korax rummaged through his overcoat for a phone and handed the receiver to Brian. There was only one button on the phone. Boy, this technology is something. He grinned with tears in his eyes. Korax smiled softly and Groom wagged his tail. He pressed the button and waited for a response. After a short conversation, the call ended, and he handed the phone back to Korax. Thank you both so much. I'm happy to finish this. Thank you, Brian, their voices said. Be cool. They were right. It wasn't painful. Next chapter. Brian picked up the phone, angry that he was already late, but someone calling him at 7:12 on a Tuesday morning was going to make him late. Great, he muttered. Taking the handset off the wireless charger, he answered the call. Hello, he barked into the receiver. You had a crush on Paula Ventrone in high school, but you didn't tell anyone. You freaked out on prom night when she admitted she'd always wanted you to ask her out. The voice in the receiver was oddly familiar, similar to his brother's voice, but not quite the same. Older. Who the hell is that? Brian was shocked. No one knew about this. Ever. You know who it is. Call me today. Do anything but come in. Why? Don't do it. The caller then read out a series of numbers. What are these? Write them down. That's Paula Ventrone's phone number. She still wants to hear from you. And the call ended. Brian sat looking at the phone in his hand. For a minute, he looked around the room, then picked up the phone again. Sometime after lunch, Brian received another call. The caller identified himself as a member of the plant's emergency response network. There had been an explosion at the plant that had killed 2 engineers who had improperly vented air from one of the chambers. They needed him immediately, if at all possible. Brian grabbed his jacket and headed out the door. It looked like his date with Paula would have to be postponed for a day or two. The end. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.